Us today. I'm Melissa Barnett. I'm the director of the Francis McClelland Institute for Children, Youth, and Families, or FMI. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Jessica Andrews-Hanna with us today. Before I turn it over to her, I do want to, first of all, invite you to some upcoming FMI events. Our annual end of the semester event is very exciting. It's a student poster showcase. We hope you join us in 2 weeks for that. And we are also partnering with some community organizations to present a screening of the film Resilience on Wednesday, April 23rd. To find out about those events, please visit our website. And if this is your first FMI event, we hope it's not your last and you'll continue to join us. And before we get any further, I do want to share what was the official land acknowledgement of the University of Arizona that was developed in partnership with tribal representatives. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'atham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. I also want to take a little time to tell you about the Francis McClelland Institute, or FMI. Our goal is to work in partnership to build communities that support family resilience so that children, youth, and families, especially those experiencing adversity, have opportunities to thrive. We do this by supporting innovative research, actively partnering with community organizations, sharing research findings with practitioners in the community, and educating the next generation of engaged scholars and leaders. We also are really excited that this talk is part of a two-part series related to the Science of Kindness Community Collective, which is an initiative of FMI. The goal of SciKind is to contribute to the creation of a community of practice to increase kind behavior for the benefit of all. And then I want to tell you a little bit about Francis McClelland, and really all of the work that we do is to honor her legacy. Francis lived a life that personified and facilitated resilience. She was the child of Irish immigrants who at the time were very much discriminated against immigrant group. This inspired her to live a life that created opportunities for other immigrant families. She, at a very young age, contracted polio, and although she was physically disabled for the rest of her life, she did not let that hold her back. And in fact, it made her a staunch advocate for people with disabilities. She graduated from the U of A with a degree in business at a time when it was uncommon for women to obtain such degrees, making her a real warrior committed to creating opportunities for education for women and other marginalized communities. She was an advocate for children, youth, and families. She was an extremely generous philanthropist and leader in our community. And again, we continue to do work to honor her legacy. We also want to take a moment to thank Pamela Turbeville. This is the Pamela Turbeville Speaker Series. Pam is another distinguished alum who continues to support our program. And finally, the reason you're here, I'm very happy to turn the stage over to Dr. Andrews-Hanna, who is an associate professor of psychology and cognitive science at the University of Arizona and the interim director of the cognitive science program. A cognitive neuroscientist by training, Dr. Andrews-Hanna completed her master's in neuroscience at Washington University in St. Louis and her PhD in psychology at Harvard University. At the U of A, Dr. Andrews-Hanna directs the Neuroscience of Emotion and Thought, or NET, laboratory. Her research is centered on understanding the mystery of human imagination, the thoughts, ideas, memories, and emotions that make us unique as individuals. Dr. Andrews-Hanna is passionate about characterizing how the imaginative brain changes across the lifespan and in relation to neurological disease and mental health, with an ultimate goal of developing interventions to help people harness the beneficial aspects of imagination and live happier and healthier lives. Dr. Hanna's research is supported by the National Institute of Aging and the National Institute of Mental Health. So thank you so much for coming across campus to join us today.
All right, well, thanks very much. I'm excited to be here to make it over to this end of campus. Much better view than in the psychology building, I will say. So yeah, I'm super excited to be talking here as part of the, I guess, the PsyChi, the second instantiation I'm learning of the Science of Kindness Collective here. And I'm excited to also connect a bit with the Frances McClellan Institute. I started that process fairly recently through your very own Jeanette Mare, who I know can't be here. But she and I have been connecting on shared interests, and it's a nice opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing over in the psych building and maybe explore opportunities for collaboration. So just to give you, to touch a little bit on the introduction, I direct the Neuroscience of Emotion and Thought Lab over in the psychology department. I also have a directorship, I guess, of the cognitive science program, which is a very interdisciplinary program. And my lab, of which Shan is a wonderful postdoc here, I'm very excited that she was able to come, really studies the neuroscience of imagination very broadly construed. And that includes social cognition and includes all the wonderful applications of social cognition like kindness and compassion, which I'll be talking about today. We do focus on sort of the neuroscience, like what's going on at the level of the brain. So I do have a lot of pictures of brains in my talk. And if things aren't clear, or if I'm, lapsing and pretending I'm talking to a neuroscience audience and you need me to explain things, please just, speak up. As well as at any other part of my talk, if you have questions or want to interrupt, I'm fine with that. I don't know what the typical procedure is here. Before I begin my actual slides, I wanted to make sure that I thank all the people that have gone into this work. So of course there's my wonderful lab at U of A, but the people on the left are folks from where I was previously at the University of Colorado Boulder, who I've collaborated with on a bunch of the work that I'll be talking about today. And then of course, here at U of A, there's a ton of other people to thank in our department, as well as our beloved Emily, who is involved in this big grant that I'll be talking about and some of the exciting findings coming out from it. All right, an example of what compassion is, right? Doing something that is the right thing to do, even if people aren't around you to observe it. And the other thing that is kind of remarkable about this, even though I don't personally study development in kids and in adolescents of these capacities, it's so clear that there are so many examples of kids being compassionate, right? So this definition that is commonly used is the benevolent emotional response towards another who is suffering. So it has a suffering component, coupled with the motivation to alleviate their suffering and promote their well-being. So a sense of action, right? A sense of helping, which is related to kindness, of course. I'm preaching to the choir here. But the suffering piece is also a critical component here. All right. And so, of course, I don't need to, I think we're all on the same page that compassion is beneficial for society. It's beneficial for the recipient of that compassionate act, whether that be a human or an animal, in this particular example. But also there's a lot of evidence suggesting that it benefits the giver of compassion as well, in the case of this young man. And we also know from a lot of research that compassion and kindness works by fostering social connection. And there are a ton of health and mental well-being benefits for the feeling that we're part of a larger social group. And we know this because when social resources are unavailable, our body and our brain kind of answer to the threat response. We have the idea is that we are social beings as humans. We evolved a brain that's a very much social brain, thought to expect social resources. And when that's lacking, as in the case of loneliness, for example, we kind of go into this hyperdrive or shut down, right? So of course we know also that we're in a period of a loneliness epidemic in our country. The former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy declared a loneliness epidemic about 2 years ago. And loneliness also, as synonymous with social disconnection, has important threats to our physical, our mental, and our cognitive well-being. So in the rest of my talk today, I will do a number of things. First, I will provide an overview of how neuroscientists think about compassion, what's going on in the brain, what are the different components that interact together to result in compassionate and pro-social behavior. And then I'll talk about a number of studies. This first study looks at predictive brain neural markers of aspects of compassion or precursors to compassion, empathic care and distress, and how that can then lead to, in the case of this study, charitable donations. And study two, I'll talk about some research we're advancing in our lab here at U of A on the neuroscience of empathy and real world helping behavior. This is specifically in romantic couples. In study three, I'll talk about an extension of that work, looking at how couples and other close individuals can sort of see themselves as an extension of someone else and see someone else as an extension of themselves. And that self-other overlap can be very beneficial, but it can also come at some costs. And then in study four, I'll talk about some of our attempts to cultivate compassion through contemplative interventions. We'll see how far I get through. I think we started a little late, so I'm also happy to just cut off at the cutoff mark, just so that I know what is a good mark to cut off for questions and things like that.
You haven't until 2:15, so it's wherever it feels comfortable in that range.
So I'll try by 2 and go from there. Okay. All right. So so from a neuroscience perspective, you know, the brain is engaged in a very, very interactive way, right? Involving a number of different brain systems that are thought to represent these cognitive, social, emotional capacities that are thought to be ingredients of compassion, all right? So in this particular example, this model, you can imagine having some sort of stimulus, right? Approaching, for example, this woman who very clearly is in need in her particular state. And what it seems to be going on, according to a lot of these theories, is that the observer is simultaneously experiencing a flood of affective feelings, a flood of emotions. Often those feelings happen very automatically, are not super well controlled, right? But then also a more potentially deliberate, slower process happens where we're able to reason about the mental states of other people, right? So we can form inferences about what that person's thinking about and maybe that person's particular situation. Now, these processes have a number of different terms in the social neuroscience and cognition literature. So the affective feelings set of processes is sometimes referred to as experience sharing, as emotional contagion, right? Do you cry when you see other people crying? Affective empathy, and personal distress, often in the case of compassion. Whereas the other set of processes is often referred to as cognitive empathy, or mentalizing, or theory of mind, or perspective taking. It's thought to be this more cognitive component, right? Now, ultimately, what our model is proposing here is that these two parallel processes are basically feeding into a different set of brain regions that seeks to make meaning and understanding of the whole situation in relation to you and your sense of self. All right, so there's these other sets of regions that I'll talk about that that support the ability to appraise a meaning of the situation. That process is often referred to as empathic or personal concern, sometimes self-relevance, sometimes a feeling of tenderness and care. All right. So this is what Batson, has focused on when he talks about the necessary ingredient of compassion, where you really feel like you care for the person in need, and that seems to be very predictive of actually helping them. All right, and so ultimately, right, we make some meaning out of the situation. Hopefully we'll decide to help the person, but sometimes based on the meaning, particularly if it's, depending on how you relate it to yourself, maybe you would decide to avoid or withdraw from the particular situation. Now, when it comes to the brain, there's a decent amount of support that there are a number of brain regions that are talking to one another and are supporting these different aspects of and ingredients and precursors of compassion. So the regions in red belong to what's often referred to as the salience network, and also inclusive of the mirror neuron system, right? That include regions like the anterior insula here, the dorsal anterior cingulate, the amygdala, responsible for that rapid emotional response. And so those regions are thought to be engaged very quickly and automatically, right? The emotional reactivity that you might get from a situation. And these other regions in blue are part of a brain network that my lab studies a lot called the default mode network that we use when we're turning our attention inwards and, using our imagination in different respects. So in this case, it's thought that we're inferring what that person's mental state is. We might be simulating what we would do in that situation or, other sorts of processes. And then this region in green, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, in its connection with subcortical structures like the nucleus accumbens that has a lot of dopamine in the brain, are collectively part of our value systems, very integrated with our meaning-making systems. What does it mean to us, and do I care enough to do something about it, right? So that's kind of the idea in this model that we have. And the subsequent studies are hopefully going to provide a bit of support for that model. All right. So now I'll get into the first study that we ran at University of Colorado Boulder that aims to understand what's going on in the brain, right? When people are feeling these aspects of compassion, and do they actually predict the amount of, in this case, money that people are willing to give out of their own pocket to people in need. Okay. So there has been a decent amount of neuroscience literature on empathy and compassion, but it's probably fair to say that most of those studies tend to use very kind of lab-based tasks, like the one here, observing a stranger's distress in some way. And often it's a part of the body, like a hand or foot or something, in which you observe that person in pain, right? But to what degree is that relevant to, or like applicable to the full complexities of the situation in the real world is a big question, right? Fewer studies assess the predictors of prosocial behavior, of actually measuring willingness to help and instances and behaviors of help. Usually the degree to which they do this, it tends to be hypothetical. Would you, if you were in this situation, actually help the person in need? Yes or no. But it's not necessarily, they're not necessarily assessing what people would actually do, right? So this study had a goal to examine what the brain can tell us about these more ecologically valid metrics of compassion, ways to assess compassion. And so in this first study, we brought a group of 60 some odd people into the lab, and 57 of those participants, had usable data. And all of the participants perform this task in an MRI scanner. All right, so we're measuring patterns of brain activity in different places as people are undergoing this task. And there were different phases to this task. So the trials, the stimuli, were these biographies of people who are real people that are actually in need. And we created these biographies by calling different charity websites that are looking for donations to help these individuals. So we came up with these 24 stimuli of other people in need, ranging across age, and their stories were kind of different. All right. And so an example of that is this one here. Angela and her mom are homeless and move from shelter to shelter in New York City. She has fallen behind academically and had to repeat a grade. She suffers from anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. A charitable after-school program provides Angela with stability and help in school. She's now thriving and loves learning about animals and spelling. So the participants are seeing the picture of Angela on the screen and are listening to the audio that tells her story. All right. And they do this for all the 24 different biographies. All right. After that, they can choose on a trial by trial basis how much of the $100 we gave them to participate in the study. We gave them, anyway, I'll get to those details later. How much of the $100 we gave them to participate in the study, they would like to donate to that charitable organization where the money will go back to Angela. All right. They were told that one trial would be randomly selected and we would actually implement that donation. So they didn't have to split their $100 over all the 24 participants or 24 stimuli. We also had participants then rate the feelings, attributions, and sort of self-similarity to those different targets on the screen, so we can kind of investigate the cognitive mechanisms at play here. Okay, so that was done in the scanner, and now, of course, we are measuring the patterns of brain activity and their behavioral responses, and kind of want to put them together. Okay, so in this study, what we're really looking at is two different processes called empathic care and empathic distress, and this sort of maps onto the meaning making and concern, those sort of green regions or value systems that we have in our brain, as well as our personal distress, the sense that this evokes pain in me, right? I'm personally emotionally distressed. So part of what participants did after the scan is rate these different dimensions of their own feeling states when they're listening to these biographies dynamically over time. So we have these time courses of, as the audio is being played, how much care do I have right now? How much personal distress do I have, et cetera. And basically what we're doing then is we're fitting these time courses of feelings to the brain activity that, of course, is also unfolding in this temporally dynamic way as well. All right. And we're creating this kind of predictive model of brain activity patterns that best match and predict the participants' ultimate feelings. All right. All right. So without spending too much time on the nitty-gritty of the regions here, what we found is that in orange, there are a number of regions that mostly fall within that quote unquote mirror neuron system, as well as parts of the insula, which we know is involved in kind of your emotional response, that seem to track participants' momentary by momentary rating of how personally distressed they feel when they're listening to the biographies. We have a different set of regions that include these value kind of dopaminergic regions that seem to track how much concern people report for the participants, right? And ultimately, activity in both of those regions, or both of those networks, these patterns, in both cases predicts on a trial by trial basis of how much money the participant is actually going to donate to the charitable organization sponsoring that target. All right, so here's some at least initial evidence that there are these sort of separable but interacting brain systems that are tracking our different feeling states and are ultimately integrated together to yield sort of real world behavior. All right, anyone have questions so far? Yes.
The participants get $100 to donate. Do they get to keep the $100 if they don't donate it all away? Or is it like only?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so they could keep it if they don't give it away.
Yes.
Okay, that helpful for me to think about. And then also, since you have over time with the 24 different bios, was there any sense of, I don't know a good word for it, like apathy, like as the more they heard, like the less they felt because they were just getting tired of hearing story after story after story of someone in need?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I don't think we looked at the like linear changes. That would be a really good idea, but it is relevant. It might be relevant to the last study that I'll
Oh,
talk about.
cool. Sorry, I didn't get your question, Nick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was wondering like what proportion of variation in this predicting giving outcome did these account for? You know, like what was the R squared or something like that if it was calculated?
It's a very good question, and I did not report that here. I would have to look that up. It's not
Like a small amount?
with brain activity metrics, they're usually on the smaller side. So we're probably looking at a small to medium effect.
Mhm.
But I'm a little hesitant. I'll have to research that in the paper.
No,
I've forgotten about
that's fine. I would guess that would be the case, but
All right. Okay, so moving on to study 2. All right, now we are sort of zooming into empathy, but then also looking at empathy's ability to predict how much support romantic couples give each other. All right, so just a little bit of background motivating the empathy study. So I mentioned that most studies of compassion and empathy typically involve a stranger and witnessing that stranger in distress, right? But we know from other studies that in day-to-day life, we actually experience quite a lot of empathy, not with strangers, but with people that are close to us, right? People we care about, that we might be friends with, family members, and romantic partners with, right? The other thing we know is that we actually have more opportunities in day-to-day life not to experience empathy in response to people's suffering, but vicarious reward in response to good things that happen to them. So positive empathy. And that's generally a more neglected aspect of empathy. We also know that, you know, there's some hints, at least, that there are very important dyadic effects, right? So how much empathy I am able to give, does that affect my partner, and vice versa. So that's kind of together what we wanted to test. Now, in the context of romantic relationships or close relationships, presumably we should be good at this, right? Because particularly when it's a person we care about, we know that feeling empathy for them will directly, in many cases, actually benefit us, right? But we also know that often people fail in some ways to really provide as much empathy as they want to in day-to-day life. And why is this the case, right? Because as we go into about our day-to-day life, we also have we also have our own mood states and things, sources of stress that are happening to us, etc., that overcoming our own mental state to, imagine the perspective of someone else and take on their feelings and emotions is actually quite difficult. It requires quite a lot of emotion regulation on our behalf, right? And so we are seeking to test these more difficult empathy contexts in everyday life in this particular study. And to set up our paradigm, I wanted to kind of take you guys through a little hypothetical scenario, all right? So imagine this is a situation that may happen to you in whatever, ways that it could in your own life, right? You receive some really negative and feedback that makes you kind of ruminate and think not so great about it, right? So you're in this kind of bad mood about this feedback that you received. And then imagine you come home to your friend or your partner or your family or whatnot, and your partner is telling you that they have received this great accomplishment or some aspect of positive feedback in their life, right? Now, to be a supportive partner, this is the exact time that you want to feel empathic to them. You want to say, that's really great, and do the things that you should do to support that partner, right? In a very interactive way, right? And the degree to which we do this increases the idea, our relationship satisfaction, right? And our well-being. The problem is, of course, this is really difficult because particularly at these moments, we are not feeling so great ourselves, and we have to kind of overcome a conflicting mental state to appropriately feel empathy for a close other, okay? So this idea of overcoming the self, how do we overcome the self in this difficult empathy context, is one thing that we really wanted to investigate in this next study, all right? So in this study, this is a very ongoing study. The data that I'll be presenting was in 131 total participants, coming from 71 romantic couples. So we recruited both participants into our lab, had them complete a whole battery of multi-method tasks. The average relationship duration for our couples was 8.3 years, all right? People were required to have been living together for at least 6 months. The mean is 6.5 years, right? And then here are some other details about our participants. For the talk today, I'm going to be focusing on these elements of our study, but it's very ongoing, and we're doing all this everyday life kind of stuff with ecological momentary assessment that we're very excited about as well. Okay, so to try to mimic this hypothetical scenario, we developed what we're calling the close task, connected lives overcoming the self for empathy. All right, and basically what it is a social feedback task in which participants are in the scanner and they receive social feedback from who they believe are other participants in the study, all right, directed to themselves. All right, so on the left, you might, you'll see an example of a stimulus. So this feedback in this case is directed to the participant in the scanner, and it's good feedback. It's feedback that the person in that picture thinks you're likable, all right? May want to talk to you in general. Critically, the feedback can also be directed to the partner. Now, the participants know that their partners are also going to receive the same feedback. And so in this situation where you receive good feedback, your partner receives bad feedback, you might spontaneously empathize with them, right? Because you know they're going to see it. We had this kind of deception aspect of the study that I can talk about if there's time at the end and you're interested. Both partners completed the task back to back. Okay, so it's a measure of spontaneous empathy. And then after half the trials, participants rated how positive or negative that feedback made them feel. All right, so that's their measure of their own personal affect. All right, so the interesting thing about this task is we have a number of different conditions, trial types here. So in the self-only feedback, here the partner feedback is blocked out. There is a whole story as to how that could happen. So you can either receive positive or negative feedback directed to yourself. We have another condition in which the feedback is now only directed to the partner. All right, this would be sort of a traditional empathy kind of task used in the literature. And then critically, we have these simultaneous, more difficult feedback empathy conditions that are requiring you to kind of, your own feedback is in conflict with the feedback of your partner, and you have to some degree, overcome your own feedback to empathize with your partner, right? And the most difficult condition, we thought, would be this one here, where you receive negative feedback and your partner receives positive feedback, all right? And then we compare brain activity and behavior during this particular condition to more easier conditions, okay? All right, so now what I'm showing here are the affect ratings associated with these different contrasts between different conditions. Okay, so if you focus just on the partner positive versus the sort of neutral, no feedback, condition, positive affect ratings mean you're reporting that you're feeling positive, or meaning that it's a positive difference here, actually, and negative means that it's a negative difference. Okay, so people are generally happier when they receive positive feedback versus no feedback. Now, interestingly, overcoming the self in this conflicting situation, they also receive more positive feedback. They're able to overcome their negative mental state, but critically, the difference in feedback is significant. The amount of affective empathy that they're experiencing here is a bit attenuated, right? Okay. Now, also just to note that people in higher quality relationships, this is a separate study that a different postdoc at Diego Guevara Beltran is working on. People in higher quality relationships are actually more sensitive to their partner's feedback. So they're going to show less attenuation, all right? This is what we see when the feedback is negative, all right? So people's affect, is more negative. But here we don't see any attenuation. There's not a significant difference between the difficult empathy situation when you receive positive feedback and your partner receives negative feedback. It's much easier for you to overcome a good state than for you to kind of be the opposite. All right, now what is happening in the brain during these different task conditions? All right, I'm going to jump to kind of the summary slide here. What we're showing here, all of the regions in blue are the regions linked to that are more active for quote unquote easy traditional empathy contrasts. So these include regions that are part of the salience network to code our affective feelings, and the mirror neuron network and the default mode network, regions involved in cognitive and affective empathy and personal concern, et cetera, right? But the regions in red are regions that are conversely more engaged in that very difficult empathy contrast. All right, these happen to be regions that are very important for executive function and emotion regulation, your ability to, engage in more higher order cognition that we think is important for overcoming your mental state. All right, so what we're seeing is that these traditional empathy regions are actually being downregulated in these empathy contrasts. It's more difficult, and so we don't get as much sort of neural empathy as a result of that process. Does that sort of make sense? Hopefully, sort of. Okay. All right. Now, interestingly, we had all of this behavior, of course, and we also collected individual difference metrics in people's emotion regulation abilities, right? And so if our empathy task is predicting anything of interest, then presumably people who are able to engage in empathy during our task may have a better ability to engage in emotion regulation. And that's exactly what we found here, behaviorally. But we also found it in the case of a number of brain regions where the degree to which these particular brain regions were engaged in these difficult empathy contrasts actually predicted people's trait emotion regulation, right? So we think that emotion regulation is a very critical component of your ability to overcome your own mental state and experience empathy in these difficult contexts. Now, what is perhaps most interesting is that we also measured people's actual supportive behavior in everyday life. And so this data is coming from a daily diary that we gave to participants and their partners at the end of every day. And what we're showing, at least in the case of this particular brain region involved in mentalizing, is that the degree to which people engage this brain region during these difficult empathy tasks predicts how supportive their partner is saying they were that day on like a day-to-day basis, right? So if you tend to be a more supportive partner, then in the context of this task, you're going to engage these regions, right? So we think this is pretty solid evidence for the role of these, like sort of the neural instantiation of empathy in the context of these challenging situations. Anyone have questions on this particular section? Okay.
So I did have a question. So that's really for that day. What about sort of over time? I mean, what extent to which is this sort of temporally or situationally activated?
Yeah, that is a really good question that Shan and others are looking into. For this particular slide, actually what we did is we averaged across all the days in
Okay.
which they used daily, they used it,
Okay.
did the daily diary and create this average metric of support provision, supportive behavior. All right. And so now I'll talk about an interesting extension of this study, and it's this idea known as self-other overlap. All right, it's this idea in social psychology, where aspects of one's partner is perceived as an extension of yourself. All right, so it's commonly measured. This is a very common scale that you guys are probably familiar with, called the inclusion of other in self scale, right? Where you need to choose how much of your partner, what is the overlap between your own sort of self and your partner, all right? And the self-other overlap, you can think of it as applying partly to the overlap in perspectives and characteristics of your partner, but also potentially in their resources, right? If you see your partner as an extension of yourself, then presumably their gain is your gain, right? You're processing what's happening to them in the same way that you process yourself, exposed to that same gain or loss, right? And so the question, and mostly self-other overlap and aspects of self-overlap have been studied entirely psychologically. But what we wanted to do in this particular study is look at overlap in brain activity patterns to see if the neural overlap is predictive to some degree of important relationship metrics. Okay, so we're going to use the same task here. This is the same, effectively the same participants, a slightly larger sample size here. And we're only now focusing on these two different conditions where either you are receiving feedback, right? But your partner is not. So how does your brain process you receiving positive feedback versus a separate trial type in which your partner is receiving the same feedback, right? So it's directed to your partner. And basically, essentially what we're doing is we're correlating all the different voxels of brain activity patterns on a trial by trial basis between these two different conditions. And if there's a high correlation, then the idea is you have very strong neural representation overlap, neural self-other overlap, okay? It looks a little bit more complex. Shan can explain all the details if you're interested in, but effectively we're getting this metric of representational similarity in the brain, all right? We also have similar metrics to our behavior, but I'm not going to talk about that so much. Now, the brain region that we wanted to focus on here is part of our sort of self-value systems. So part of the medial prefrontal cortex here that's really connected to our reward systems. And we think part of that empathic concern, sort of care, with the idea that, if this brain region, seems to code how relevant something is to yourself, then presumably if you see your partner as an extension of yourself, it's going to really be showing similar patterns in this particular region, okay? All right, so here what I'm showing here is activity when people are seeing positive feedback directed towards themselves and their partner in comparison to the negative feedback. And what's being plotted is the neural representational similarity, the amount of it in this brain region. And so what we can see is that on the right, when people are receiving negative feedback, there's more representational similarity. And I think the implication here is that individuals are more likely to internalize their partner's negative feedback, negative outcomes, as if it were their own versus their positive outcomes. Okay, so that was kind of the first piece of evidence. Now, this study involved a whole lot of APIM models, which you may be familiar with in your department. And APIM models, in case you're not familiar with it, are really these dyadic statistical models in which in a large regression analysis, you're fitting, you're sort of putting everything together. You're looking at the effect of your behavior in some ways. In this case, it's neural representational similarity of the person in the scanner, the actor, in relation to how that person's functional outcomes are, or how their partner's functional outcomes are. All right, so what the upshot from this model, and this model is focused specifically on neural representational similarity to your partner's and your positive feedback, all right? The upshot is that experiencing a partner's social feedback as your own, having more neural representation for positive feedback, is positively related not only to your own report of your relationship satisfaction, but to also your partner's relationship satisfaction, how satisfied your partner is in your relationship. So having this neural extension of self for positive stimuli seems to, although we can't say anything causally, but seems to be related to, good things in your relationship. Okay. Now, interestingly, we found a somewhat similar thing in response to negative feedback, where neural representational similarity for negative feedback seems to predict your partner saying that they value that you have a higher quality relationship, but not your own rating. All right. And I think what was most interesting is that when we look at these temporal effects, where we look at 6 months later, how the sort of mental health symptoms, we find that at 6 months, this greater neural representational similarity seems to be predictive of the actor's depression and negative mood. All right. So I think the overall implication here is that while taking on your partner's negative mental states is probably healthy for the relationship, at least in the current time, it may come at a cost to where you're actually internalizing more of your partner's negative affect, and that may put you at risk for symptoms of depression, right? So that's a kind of a big conundrum here. And when we think about things like, compassion fatigue and such, I think there are really some interesting implications. All right, so the last, almost done here. Does anyone have questions from that part? Okay, so the last piece of the talk here represents an attempt to cultivate compassion with a contemplative tradition called compassion meditation, also very similar to loving kindness or metta meditation. And this is this contemplative practice where people are being trained to mentally practice feeling kind, benevolent, and compassionate feelings towards others in need, right? And usually these meditations include an element of mindfulness, mindful attention and awareness. They also typically incorporate mantras that involve wishing well-being on other people and freedom from suffering. So an example is you may first start with yourself. They often include a component of self-compassion as well, all right? So may you be safe, may you be healthy, may you be happy, may you live with ease in the world, may I be safe, may I be happy, etc. Right? May an acquaintance be happy. So close loved ones, acquaintances, and yourself. And over time, the idea is that hopefully this is helping people become more aware and deliberately noticing of people's states in need, and evoking more compassionate behavior as well. Okay, so that's sort of the theory. And we had the opportunity to work with Roshi Joan Halifax at the Upaya Zen Center, close by, actually, I think in New Mexico. And she actually has done a lot of this implementation work, developing her own versions of compassion meditation and taking it out into the community. So she actually helped us develop this compassion intervention that we delivered on a smartphone app. So in this particular task setup, participants listen to the same biographies, the first task paradigm that I showed you about with the people from charity websites in need and had some story. They listen to all these particular biographies in the pre-intervention version of the task. This was also done in an MRI scanner. And then participants in the compassion meditation group went through, over a 2-week time, this compassion meditation where they were kind of going through the compassion meditation script, but then they were practicing feeling compassion to the individuals in this biography. All right. They also heard about their stories again. And then as a part of kind of a attention check, they answered this particular factual question. For example, what was Mike's hardship? All right. Now, critically, we had 2 other groups and other interventions. We had a familiarity group that on a day-to-day basis simply saw the biographies again. Every day it cycled through a different biography. And so they simply saw the biographies again, and hopefully became a little bit more familiar with the stories presented in those biographies. And then what we thought was very interesting is the larger meditation literature. Often it has been proposed that a big part of why meditation might work is the expectation effects, that you're engaged in meditation because it's going to help improve an aspect of your life, right? So this is in Tor Wager's lab. He's very interested in expectation effects in his lab. So we had another group in which we told people that oxytocin will increase your compassion. It's been shown in other studies to increase your compassion. And here's an oxytocin nasal spray that we would like you to take every night while you're looking at these biographies, right? So in that, you can imagine that that group is thinking, oh, this is going to make me more compassionate. So it's our attempt to kind of determine to what degree the contemplative intervention was due partly to these expectation effects. Okay. Now, a component of a very related study involved extracting these summary metrics, what we call feeling attribution similarity scores, where in a separate study, we put together these biographies and we asked people a number of different questions in response to each biography: how much personal distress you were in, how much tenderness, instrumentality of helping, would my donating actually help you, and then how similar in various respects you are to that particular person in need. And we created this model to determine, to put them all together to determine which aspects of these feelings, attributions, and similarities predicted charitable donation in the context of the other study. And so our FAS scores are essentially composed of the different weights of these different feeling states, etc. And what you can see is that the questions that were predictive of the amount of money that people actually donated were the feelings, personal distress and tenderness, as well as the instrumentality of helping. And a little bit significant in the opposite direction is how much blame they consider the target to have. All right, but the similarity metrics didn't have any bearing in the context of our study on charitable donation. So we created these FAS scores and applied those metrics to our the separate study, where we randomized people to these different groups: compassion, meditation, oxytocin, and familiarity. And what we are finding here on the left is we're looking at changes in these FAS scores from pre-intervention to post-intervention, all right? And we find significant differences with the compassion meditation condition, that group, in relation to, with respect to, or compared to, both the familiarity group and the oxytocin placebo group. So that's kind of interesting. At least people are feeling more empathic and aspects of compassion, sort of to a greater degree in the compassion meditation group. Now, when we actually look at changes in donation, like how much money people give, in the context of this particular study, when they came back after their intervention, they viewed all of the biographies again and were given another $100 and asked if they wanted to donate any of their money. What we found is that the familiarity group actually donated less, possibly because they thought, I already donated money at time one, I don't need to donate again, or it might get to this compassion fatigue kind of question that was similar, that was brought up in the past. So the donation actually goes down. And what we're seeing is that compassion meditation sort of rescues it a little bit, right? But it's not the case that people are significantly donating more at time two. They're just not, it's being a little bit protected from not donating at all. All right. And in this case, there wasn't a significant difference between the compassion meditation and the oxytocin placebo group. All right. So possibly some, although this is somewhat underpowered, some of the effect might be driven by expectations here. All right. And importantly, the change in FAS scores on an individual difference basis was predictive of the change in money that they donated to these targets. And it mediated it as well. Okay, so to summarize, I have a little bit of time. To summarize, we've shown that brain signatures of empathic care and personal distress seem to be separable, and they combine to predict charitable donation. That brain activity and affective feelings of empathy associated with these very difficult empathic situations in romantic couples are predicted by emotion regulation ability and seem to predict daily partner support. That representing your partner as an extension of yourself was generally related to improved relationship satisfaction. But if you're doing that, taking on your partner's negative outcomes, then that may come at the expense of your own mental health. And that compassion can indeed be cultivated, at least in our sample, with contemplative training, although there might be an effective expectation as part of that. So I think there are a ton of opportunities for future directions. I could put several slides together on that. We can talk about that a little bit. But I think understanding how these processes develop at a young age might be particularly important, particularly if we can enhance emotion regulation abilities. That might, have downstream effects on having more empathy and more, pro-social behavior. And also thinking about, compassion fatigue, and also, these phenomena where now, particularly in society currently, where there are a lot of people currently in crisis and currently in need, how do we protect ourselves from, diluting our compassion, because we're seeing so many different examples of this. All right, well, thank you very much. happens. Yes.
So in study 4 with the similarity scores, I was really happy that you were looking at that because I was thinking of some parenting literature and research that suggests that when parents can relate more to like the same sex child, that they kind of favor them more.
Oh,
In a very
interesting.
similar type of you get some money, who would you give it to?
Oh, wow.
Kind of study. And so I'm happy to see that you didn't find that matter much because it gives me hope that like people will do nice things for people who aren't like them. And that's a really cool thought and takeaway from that.
Yeah.
In particular. So I
Yeah.
share that.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it. I was not familiar with that picture.
I had a couple of questions from like the first study, kind of tying to some of the questions Joel had asked earlier. I was wondering, with regards to the 24 scenarios, if you like randomly like changed the order in which those scenarios came about, just to also see like not just fatigue, but potentially there might be something about like the people you read about or hear about at the very end, they're more salient.
Mhm.
And so how that might impact things. So like if there was any kind of control for the timing of when something appeared. In these
I'm
analyses.
pretty sure that at least across participants, the order was randomized. I need to check on that. And then with respect to the, and I think that was the case. Yeah, that definitely was the case with respect to the app. On a different day, you know, the app would randomly choose without replacement one of the targets. So, but that is a really, I'll have to look into, you know, those kinds of attentional or memory kind of effects. So it's a great question.
And then I had a question about the actor partner model, and I don't know if you can pull it up, but trying to like think about how to interpret that. I found it really interesting and like super interesting, this concept of like, you know, your perception of similarity and so on. And I was hearing the interpretation thinking like, if you think that you're the same or like cognitively we're seeing this like mental structure kind of showing that there's this thinking of that being the same, that might lead to like satisfaction. But at least when I'm looking at this, it's really the partner and what they think is impacting the actor. And so would it be more like, if the partner thinks you're the same, then that's impacting the actor. And so like maybe there's this kind of like partner almost spillover happening where they're like, I had a negative thing happen. I think we're the same. Therefore, like, I'm really gonna like tell you everything that happened. And so then that might lead to less satisfaction on the actor's part.
Oh, that's
you know,
very interesting.
As opposed to it being the other way, because I would expect the other interpretation you have would be coming at the actor line, which would be the horizontal one. But this is more of this like partner spillover effect. Is kind of what I, you know, and again, kind of through the process of like, because I think we're the same, I'm gonna tell you all of my bad things and have you experience all of my bad things. And then I'm just like, I'm tired, you know, and then the actor's just like, I'm tired of this.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting interpretation. I wonder, we might be able to get at that somehow in our study. I'll have to chat with Shan to see if we have some other metrics, because we're also doing these dyadic interaction tests and stuff. So we could sort of quantify to what degree the partner is like talking a lot, for example, and sharing all of their, you know, significant concerns. It's like this metric of you're in a supportive relationship, so therefore I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to let you be.
And like
kind of
obviously must
transferred.
care because we're the same.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah.
Or I wonder if there's a mediator there. It's like that you're very empathetic. Your behaviors in that interaction are then, you know, eliciting it, right?
Yeah.
Because you're really identifying with how they're feeling. You're showing these behaviors, which make them then turn and start to behave that way.
Shan, can you remind me for these particular models, did you look at mediations that like a mediator related to supportive behavior?
Yeah, we have a mediation model and it's revealed that if an individual perceive their partner directed negative feedback, just like their own, they will show higher spot provision behaviors during the day life, and then it's beneficial for the follow-up 6 months. After 6 months, both their own and their partners relationship satisfaction, because even though they are the supportive giver, that it will be beneficial for their relationships and function.
Okay.
So essentially, like, there is this like behavioral trigger that then leads to the satisfaction.
Yeah,
Which would be in the positive realm, so thinking of this from the positive. If I think we're the same, then I'm also sharing all the positive things, doing positive things, then that leads to more satisfaction, or in the negative realm. Share all the negative things, tell you all the negative things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but
That
in
makes
the positive feedback conditions, there are no significant indirect effect.
Oh,
It's just the directly affect their relationship satisfaction, maybe just that it's internalized reward for themselves, that
Yeah.
it's directly improve their romantic relationship satisfaction, not
That's interesting.
through their
only through the
daily
negative.
behavior, yeah,
Yeah.
only for them. Very cool.
I know we're almost out of time, but can I ask a related question about this?
Mhm.
Within couples and then also within people, how correlated were these? So you're sort of self-other for negative and self-other for positive. Do they tend to be highly correlated? So you were just linked for everything?
Right. I don't change
It should be at a medium level correlated. And because they are in a couple, within a couple, both partners in this couple, they should have some interdependence. If I'm unhappy, maybe my partner will feel unhappy, or maybe he doesn't feel this, but I will express my negative emotions that make him feel unhappy. Yeah, so yeah, so they will have a medium level in interdependence between their romantic relationship satisfaction or their daily effect.
Online questions? Any other questions? No?
I have two questions, and they're kind of zooming out from your work a little bit specifically to what you presented. But I was curious if you, in the literature or in your expertise know, like, how is neutral feedback perceived? Because you have positive and negative, but like, what if someone's just kind of like nodding along, or like, it's not super emotional feedback one way or the other? Like, how is that perceived? And do you think it would be different depending on relationship quality? Like, if you perceive your relationship quality to be really high, like neutral feedback would be fine or acceptable. But if you're like, oh, it's low relationship feedback and they're just nodding along, like, it's not
You'd
as
expect.
what's the word I'm looking for? Like,
Relationship enhancement.
yeah, like it's not as like, oh, it's fine.
Right. Yeah, that is a really good question, and it's not something that I have an answer to. But yeah, kind of getting, we do have these social sensitivity kind of metrics. And there's another study that involves the same task and a different set of participants, in which we're looking at individual differences in loneliness. And the idea is that, well, we're testing the hypothesis that people who are lonelier are either specifically sensitive to negative feedback or are just overall more sensitive to feedback, right? And they might be expecting some feedback, you know, if it's good, that's really great, you're really sensitive. It's bad, that's really bad, but you're very sensitive to it. So we're sort of exploring those questions, although the neutral feedback is always our control condition. So like looking at individual differences on these social sensitivity scales that we give people in relation to the neutral feedback, I think would be really interesting. Yeah, a confound, actually.
And then I just have one follow-up, which is like, for self-other like identification, how long does it take for couples to establish that? Because in your studies, they were together for years, but like if you had couples that were together for a shorter amount of time, would that effect be less salient, do you
Yeah.
think?
It is a really good, Shan, did you include relationship duration as a covariate? And did you look at how relationship duration kind of mapped onto self-other neural similarity?
In this study, I didn't because I just feel that the relationship duration would be correlated with their neural level representation or similarity. That if we just covariate this, it
Oh.
will exclude some effect of their their neural levels of other overlap. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, maybe we should explore that in more detail, because it could be that it could also start to go down. If you're together so long, it's like, oh gosh. You know, you start to whatever. So that's a really good question that I think we need to dig into a little bit more. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right.